The capital city of Pennsylvania presents a dual identity to the observer, a contrast carved into the very pavement of its streets. To the outsider, Harrisburg is defined by the imposing masonry of the state capitol complex, a sprawling monument to legislative order and political power where laws are debated and drafted under a grand dome. It is a place of suits, polished marble, and history. However, remove the lens from the government district and shift the focus into the residential arteries of the city, and a different reality emerges. Here, the laws drafted a few miles away often feel abstract, overshadowed by the immediate and visceral codes of the street. The neighborhoods surrounding the seat of power are communities of resilience and struggle, where families navigate an ecosystem that can turn volatile with little warning. In these zip codes, the architecture is not of grand rotundas, but of row homes, corner stores, and narrow streets lined with parked sedans. Among these thoroughfares is South 17th Street. It is a stretch of road that serves as a vein through the residential body of the city, specifically the 1100 block. In March of 2022, this block was indistinguishable from countless others in Harrisburg. It was a place where people lived, parked their cars, and walked to local conveniences. It was a space of domestic routine. Yet, like many urban corridors in Pennsylvania's capital, it occupied a precarious space on the map of public safety. It was a neighborhood where the boundaries between a quiet afternoon and a violent tragedy were often dangerously thin, defined not by geography, but by circumstance and the chaotic interactions of young men with access to firearms. Jacoby Strain Hankerson lived within this reality. At 23 years old, he was a young man standing at a pivotal threshold of life. The age of 23 marks the definitive exit from adolescence and the entry into true adulthood. It is a time when the reckless impulses of the teenage years typically begin to settle, replaced by the foundational concerns of career, family, and long-term trajectory. Jacoby was not a symbol or a statistic. He was a son, a relative, and a friend. To the people who knew him, he possessed a gravitational pull, a presence that mattered. In the aftermath of violence, victims are often flattened into two-dimensional figures, defined solely by the manner of their death. However, on the morning of the 16th of March, 2022, Jacoby was simply a young man existing in his city, carrying the weight of his own history and the expectations of his future. The loss of a 23-year-old carries a specific weight in a community. It represents the theft of potential. By his early 20s, a person has survived the most vulnerable years of childhood, navigated the often turbulent waters of high school, and emerged as a fully formed individual. The investment of time, love, and energy by a family has reached its maturation point. When a life is extinguished at this stage, the grief is compounded by the knowledge of what was just about to begin. Jacoby had people who loved him, a support system that would later fill a courtroom to demand justice. His life was woven into the fabric of the Harrisburg community, connected to others through blood and friendship. He was not an anonymous figure on South 17th Street. He was a neighbor and a human being with a right to safety in his own environment. The 16th of March 2022 fell on a Wednesday. The calendar indicated the slow transition from the harsh Pennsylvania winter toward the tentative warmth of spring, though the air in Harrisburg often retains a biting chill well into the month. The daylight hours were extending, pushing back the evening darkness that often provides cover for criminal activity. But violence in Harrisburg is not restricted to the night. The rhythms of the city on that Wednesday were standard. Traffic flowed along the main arteries, the Susquehanna River moved sluggishly past the city banks, and the machinery of the state government turned in the distance. On South 17th Street, the day proceeded with the mundane normalcy that typically precedes a catastrophic event. Residents went about their business, unaware that the timeline of their neighborhood was about to be bisected into before and after. The environment of the streets in Harrisburg in 2022 was characterized by a pervasive tension regarding gun violence. This was not unique to the capital, but the proximity of the violence to the centers of law and order gave it a stark irony. Arguments that might have once ended in fistfights or verbal disputes were increasingly being settled with high-caliber weapons. The threshold for lethal force had lowered, and the availability of firearms meant that momentary grievances could escalate to permanent silences in the span of a heartbeat. This culture of immediate, armed retribution created an atmosphere where merely being present on the street carried an inherent risk. The victim need not be a combatant, they only needed to be present when the decision to shoot was made. For Jacoby Strain Hankerson, the 1100 block of South 17th Street was the stage for his final moments. He was outside, exposed to the world, a position that should not have been a death sentence. The geography of the block, with its rows of houses and parked vehicles, offered little cover against a mobile threat. The concept of the drive-by shooting is particularly insidious because it weaponizes the very infrastructure of the city. The vehicle, usually a tool of transport, becomes a platform for assault, allowing perpetrators to strike and vanish before the echoes of the gunshots have faded. It is a cowardly tactic, depersonalizing the violence by placing a barrier of steel and glass between the shooter and the target. It reduces a human life to an object to be fired upon while passing at speed. Looming in the periphery of this narrative were the forces that would converge on Jacoby that day. While Jacoby stood on the street, another narrative was in motion elsewhere in the city. A vehicle was navigating the grid of Harrisburg, driven by Benny Chisholm. Inside that vehicle sat 18-year-old Jyheir Mosley-Williams. The disparity in age between the shooter and the victim was 5 years, a significant gap in youth, but irrelevant in the mechanics of a homicide. At 18, Mosley-Williams was legally an adult, yet he was operating within a mindset that viewed lethal violence as an acceptable course of action. The motivations that lead an 18-year-old to arm himself and hunt for a target are often rooted in the complex and toxic dynamics of street reputation and perceived disrespect, trivialities that are magnified into matters of life and death. The convergence of these two lives, Jacoby Strain Hankerson and Jyheir Mosley-Williams, was not an accident of nature, but a collision of choices. The choice to carry a weapon, the choice to drive down South 17th Street, the choice to pull a trigger. These decisions were made against the backdrop of a city struggling to contain a rising tide of aggression. The community of Harrisburg often finds itself caught in the crossfire of such choices, forced to bear witness to the destruction of its young men. The families of the victims are left to navigate a legal system that moves slowly, often taking years to reach a resolution, while the families of the perpetrators face the loss of their own sons to the prison industrial complex. As the afternoon of March 16 progressed, the tranquility of the 1100 block was a facade. The variables required for tragedy were aligning. Jacoby Strain Hankerson remained in the vicinity, unaware that his time was being measured in minutes. The vehicle containing Mosley-Williams and Chisholm was drawing closer, moving through the streets of Harrisburg, obeying traffic signals and navigating turns indistinguishable from the thousands of other cars on the road. There was no siren to warn the residents of South 17th Street, no alarm to signal that the peace was about to be shattered. The horror of such crimes lies in their suddenness, the way a normal Wednesday afternoon is violently rewritten in the crack of a gunshot. This was the setting. A capital city divided by class and function, a residential street lined with the homes of working people, a 23-year-old man with a life ahead of him, and a vehicle carrying a teenager armed with a gun and a willingness to use it. The stage was set not for a fair confrontation or a duel, but for an execution. The silence of the street was heavy, holding the potential energy of the violence to come. In moments, the 1100 block of South 17th Street would transition from a quiet residential zone to an active crime scene, marked by yellow tape and shell casings. The story of the investigation, the agonizing legal delays, and the eventual courtroom theatrics would all follow. But they all began here, on the pavement of Harrisburg, with the loss of Jacoby Strain Hankerson. To understand how a sunny March afternoon in Harrisburg transformed into a crime scene, one must look inside the vehicle that turned onto South 17th Street. The cabin of that car contained the volatile chemistry of a deadly partnership, a distinct hierarchy of intent and complicity that would ultimately dictate the fate of 3 men. 2 would leave the scene as fugitives, and one would never leave the street at all. The dynamic between Jyheir Mosley-Williams and Benny Chisholm was not merely that of friends or acquaintances. In the eyes of the law and the grim mechanics of street violence, they had assumed the roles of pilot and gunner. Jyheir Mosley-Williams was only 18 years old. In the chronology of a human life, 18 is a pivot point, the precise moment where the juvenile justice system relinquishes its grip and the adult penal code takes hold. It is an age where actions cease to be viewed as the mistakes of a child and begin to be judged as the calculated decisions of a man. For Mosley-Williams, this transition was not marked by graduation ceremonies or workforce entry, but by the weight of the firearm he carried. To bring a gun into a vehicle is a definitive choice. It bypasses the possibility of a fist fight or a verbal argument. It signals a readiness to escalate a conflict to its absolute terminus. At 18, Mosley-Williams possessed the agency to pull a trigger, a physical action requiring only pounds of pressure, but carrying the weight of decades in a penitentiary. Beside him sat Benny Chisholm. If Mosley-Williams was the instrument of violence, Chisholm was the facilitator. The role of the driver in a drive-by shooting is often underestimated in the popular imagination, which tends to focus on the person holding the weapon. However, the driver is the architect of the encounter. He controls the approach, the speed of the engagement, and, most crucially, the escape. Without a willing driver, a shooter is stationary, vulnerable, and exposed. With a driver, the shooter becomes a predatory force, able to strike and vanish before the echo of the gunshot fades. Chisholm's presence behind the wheel transformed a teenager with a gun into a mobile tactical unit. This partnership required a synchronization of will. The driver must trust the shooter to hit the target, and the shooter must trust the driver not to panic, crash, or freeze. On the 16th of March, 2022, that trust appeared absolute. The movements of their vehicle were not erratic wanderings, but purposeful navigation through the arteries of Harrisburg. The city itself, with its grid of one-way streets and narrow residential blocks, creates a specific environment for this type of violence. South 17th Street is not a highway or a commercial boulevard. It is a neighborhood. It is a place where people park their cars, walk to corner stores, and stand on porches. To navigate this space with lethal intent requires a hardening of the heart, a dissociation from the humanity of the people inhabiting the landscape. For the occupants of the car, the street was not a community, but a hunting ground, and the people on it were reduced to potential targets or collateral damage. The relationship between Chisholm and Mosley-Williams would eventually unravel in a courtroom, dismantled by the pressures of self-preservation and the stark reality of homicide charges, but in the minutes leading up to the shooting, they were a unified front. They shared a confined space, the air likely thick with tension and the unspoken, or perhaps loudly spoken, anticipation of violence. The psychological state required to drive toward a murder is complex. It involves a suppression of the natural instinct for safety and social order. For Chisholm, gripping the steering wheel meant accepting liability for whatever left the barrel of Mosley-Williams's gun. For Mosley-Williams, watching the city roll by through the passenger window, the world was narrowing down to a single objective. Meanwhile, entirely unaware of the machinery of death approaching him, Jacoby Strain Hankerson was living the final moments of his life. At 23, Strain Hankerson was 5 years older than the man coming to kill him. Those 5 years represent a significant gap in development and maturity, the difference between a teenager and a young adult establishing his footing in the world. He was a son, a presence in his community, and a man with a future that was currently unspooling in real time. He existed in the mundane reality of a Wednesday afternoon. He was not armoring himself for war. He was simply existing in his own space. The tragedy of his position lay in the asymmetry of information. The attackers knew exactly where they were going and what they intended to do. The victim was denied any premonition, stripped of the chance to run, hide, or defend himself. The convergence of these two paths, the calculated trajectory of the vehicle, and the stationary presence of Strain Hankerson, was inevitable once the car turned onto the block. The build-up to a drive-by shooting is often described as a predatory creep, The vehicle slows, aiming to stabilize the platform for the shooter. This slowing down is a disruption of the normal traffic pattern, a subtle visual cue that often registers too late for those on the sidewalk. As Chisholm navigated the vehicle toward the target area, the power dynamic in the car shifted. The driver's job was to position the vehicle. The passenger's job was to execute the act. In this final approach, silence likely gave way to focused verbal cues, confirming the target, checking the surroundings for police, ensuring the escape route was clear. It is crucial to recognize that the violence that was about to occur was not an accident or a crime of sudden passion in the traditional sense. It was the result of a chain of decisions. The decision to acquire the gun, the decision to load it, the decision to get in the car, the decision to drive to South 17th Street. Each of these moments was an off-ramp, a chance to turn back, to choose a different outcome. Neither Mosley-Williams nor Chisholm took those off-ramps. They proceeded through every checkpoint of moral responsibility, driving steadily toward the irrevocability of murder. The partnership relied on mutual reinforcement. The presence of one emboldened the other. A lone 18-year-old might hesitate to walk down a street brandishing a weapon. Inside the steel shell of a car driven by an older associate, that hesitation evaporates, replaced by a false sense of invulnerability. The atmosphere on South 17th Street was typical for the time of day. Residents were going about their routines, the background noise of the city humming along. Into this normalcy slid the vehicle carrying Mosley-Williams. The visual of the car is the last thing many witnesses remember before the auditory trauma of the gunfire. It represents the intrusion of chaos into order. The car is a familiar object, a tool of transport, but in this context it was weaponized. As they closed the distance to Jacoby Strain Hankerson, the occupants of the car crossed a final psychological line. They were no longer just young men in a vehicle, they were assailants lying in wait. The impending confrontation was defined by its lack of confrontation. Strain Hankerson would not be given the opportunity to speak, to de-escalate, or to fight back. The method of attack chosen by Mosley-Williams, firing from a vehicle, is designed specifically to minimize risk to the shooter while maximizing lethality. It is a cowardly tactic, physically distancing the perpetrator from the reality of the damage inflicted. There is no physical contact, no struggle, just the mechanical action of pulling a trigger and the roar of an engine. This method reflects a mindset that views the victim not as a human being to be engaged with, but as an object to be removed. As the car aligned with its target, the tension inside the vehicle would have peaked. This is the point of no return. In legal terms, the conspiracy to commit the crime had fully ripened. The premeditation was complete. Benny Chisholm's role as the driver locked him into the narrative just as firmly as Mosley-Williams's grip on the gun. They were co-conspirators in a plot that would destroy one life and ruin two others. The pact made in that car, whether spoken or understood, was that they would execute this act and speed away together. They could not foresee that this unity would fracture under the weight of interrogation, that the driver would eventually turn on the shooter to save himself, or that the shooter would eventually stand before a judge and mock the devastation he caused. At that moment, however, there was only the mission. The window came down. The barrel of the weapon extended past the frame of the door, breaking the seal between the interior of the car and the public street. The timeline of Jacoby Strain Hankerson's life had run out of seconds. The build-up was over. The quiet planning, the drive across the city, the selection of the route, all of it had led to this singular, devastating instant on South 17th Street. The peace was not just shattered. It was obliterated by the intent of one young man and the complicity of another, united in a deadly purpose that would echo through the courtroom years later, breaking the invisible threshold between the vehicle's interior and the cooling March air. There was no verbal warning, no shouting match that preceded the violence, and no opportunity for de-escalation. The decision had been made blocks away, solidified by the silent agreement between the driver and the passenger. As the vehicle coasted closer to the target on South 17th Street, the rhythm of the neighborhood, the distant hum of traffic, the low murmur of residents inside their homes, was about to be shattered. Jyheir Mosley-Williams tightened his grip on the firearm. The mechanics of the weapon were simple, but the consequences of its engagement were irreversible. He pulled the trigger. The first shot cracked through the atmosphere, a sharp, concussive report that echoed off the brick facades of the surrounding row homes. It was not a singular event, but a rapid succession of violence. The muzzle flashed, illuminating the darkened interior of the car in stroboscopic bursts, casting brief, harsh shadows across the determined faces of the occupants. On the sidewalk, 2-3-year-old Jacoby Strain Hankerson had no time to process the sensory overload of the ambush. The physics of the encounter were brutally efficient. The bullets bridged the distance between the moving car and the pedestrian in a fraction of a second. The impacts were immediate. Strain Hankerson's body registered the trauma before his mind could comprehend the threat. The force of the projectiles knocked him off balance, disrupting his movement and sending him to the concrete. The suddenness of the attack left him defenseless, a stationary target against a mobile assailant who utilized the element of surprise as a primary weapon. Inside the vehicle, the smell of burnt gunpowder filled the cabin instantly, a sharp, metallic scent that clung to the upholstery and the clothes of the shooter. As the final casing ejected, clattering against the interior or bouncing out onto the asphalt, the driver, Benny Chisholm, reacted to the completion of the act. He slammed his foot onto the accelerator. The engine roared, a guttural climb in RPMs that signaled their escape. Tires bit into the pavement, screeching as the vehicle surged forward, putting distance between the shooter and the devastation he had just unleashed. They did not look back. The car sped away, weaving through the Harrisburg streets, indistinguishable from any other vehicle, except for the lingering smoke and the heavy secret of capital murder contained within its frame. Silence did not return to South 17th Street immediately. Instead, there was a chaotic void. For a few seconds, the only sound was the fading engine of the getaway car. Then, the reality of the situation set in. Residents, jolted from their evening routines by the unmistakable cadence of gunfire, hesitated behind locked doors. In neighborhoods familiar with the acoustics of violence, there is often a calculated pause, waiting to ensure the shooting has stopped before risking a look outside. Slowly, the paralysis of the event broke. Emergency dispatch centers in Dauphin County began to light up. Callers reported the shots, their voices laced with the frantic urgency of adrenaline. Information was fragmented at first, reports of a car speeding off, reports of a man down, confusion about the exact address. The 911 operators worked to triangulate the location, relaying the data to patrol units already prowling the city grid. First responders descended on the scene with sirens cutting through the night. The flashing red and blue lights painted the street in a disorienting wash of color, reflecting off parked cars and the windows of dark houses. Uniformed officers were the first to arrive, their primary directive to neutralize any active threat. They scanned the shadows, weapons drawn, clearing the immediate area before turning their attention to the victim. They found Jacoby Strain Hankerson lying on the ground, his life ebbing away on the cold pavement. The scene was frantic but procedural. Officers moved to render aid, applying pressure to wounds that were catastrophic in nature. The stark reality of gunshot trauma is far removed from its cinematic portrayals. It is messy, desperate, and often futile. Despite the immediate intervention of law enforcement and the subsequent arrival of paramedics, the damage inflicted by Mosley-Williams's barrage was too severe. The bullets had done their work with lethal precision, tearing through vital tissue and leaving the medical teams with no viable path to stabilization. The transition from a rescue operation to a death investigation happened quickly. The urgency of saving a life was replaced by the solemn necessity of preserving the scene. Yellow crime scene tape was unspooled, creating a cordon around the area where Strain Hankerson lay. This perimeter was sacred ground for the investigators. Nothing could enter or leave without documentation. The body was covered, a tragic stillness settling over the victim while the machinery of the justice system began to turn around him. Detectives from the Harrisburg Police Department arrived, ducking under the tape to confer with the patrol officers. They began the slow, methodical process of reading the street. A crime scene is a puzzle of debris, a collection of mute objects that must be coaxed into telling a story. The asphalt of South 17th Street was now a map of the event. Technicians moved with deliberate care, scanning the ground for the brass casings that were expelled from Mosley-Williams's gun. Each casing found was marked with a small, numbered placard. These tiny pieces of metal were critical. Their resting positions could help reconstruct the position of the car, the angle of the weapon, and the sequence of shots. If the casings were found in a tight cluster, it suggested a stationary shooter or a slow roll. If they were spread out over a distance, it confirmed the vehicle was moving at speed. The lack of casings might imply they remained inside the vehicle, or that a revolver was used, though the rapid nature of the fire suggested a semi-automatic. In this case, the forensic debris field would eventually corroborate the narrative of a drive-by shooting, locking the physical evidence to the timeline of the attack. The environment itself was scrutinized. Officers walked the sidewalks, looking for strike marks on nearby buildings or parked cars, stray bullets that had missed their intended target. These impacts were measured and photographed, trajectory rods inserted into bullet holes to visualize the flight path of the rounds. The geometry of the shooting was calculated, lines drawn in the air to trace back to the window of the car where Mosley-Williams had sat. Simultaneously, a canvass of the neighborhood began. Detectives knocked on doors, speaking to residents who were hesitant to get involved. They were looking for eyewitnesses, anyone who had seen the make or model of the car, a partial license plate, or a description of the occupants. In modern homicide investigations, the digital footprint is often as loud as the physical one. Officers scanned the rooflines and porches for surveillance cameras. Ring doorbells, private security systems, and business cameras were identified. The request for footage went out immediately. The hope was that one of these unblinking electronic eyes had captured the vehicle as it prowled the street or as it fled the scene. A blur of motion, a timestamp, a glimpse of a wheel rim, or a distinct sticker, any detail could be the key to identifying the transport that Benny Chisholm drove. As the night wore on, the temperature dropped, but the activity on South 17th Street remained intense. The coroner arrived, a grim formality that signaled the official end of Jacoby Strain Hankerson's presence in the physical world. The body was examined in situ, photos taken to document the position and the visible injuries before he was carefully placed into a transport bag. This removal is always a somber moment, the final departure of a resident from their community, leaving behind only a stain on the sidewalk and a family shattered by notification. The investigation rippled outward from the epicenter of the shooting. While technicians scrubbed the street for evidence, other units were already hunting for the vehicle. The description was vague initially, but every minute that passed allowed the net to tighten. Traffic cameras throughout Harrisburg were reviewed, looking for a car matching the general profile speeding away from the sector at the time of the 911 calls. The city's network of automated license plate readers, ALPRs, became a crucial tool, sifting through thousands of reads to find a vehicle that didn't belong or had moved with suspicious urgency. Back on South 17th Street, the physical cleanup began, but the psychological stain remained. The police eventually took down the tape. The placards were collected, the evidence bagged and sealed for transport to the lab. The street was reopened to traffic, but the atmosphere had changed. A young man had been executed in the public right-of-way. The sanctity of the neighborhood had been violated by a drive-by shooting that treated the street not as a community space, but as a hunting ground. The narrative of the crime was beginning to take shape in the notebooks of the detectives. It was a story of opportunity and intent. The shooter, Mosley-Williams, had not acted in self-defense. He had not been cornered. He had arrived in a vehicle, utilized the protection of its steel frame, unleashed a barrage of fire, and fled. It was a cowardly attack, executed with a detachment that chilled even experienced investigators. The victim never stood a chance. Strain Hankerson was walking one moment and gone the next, erased by the mechanics of a feud that had escalated to the ultimate finality. The ballistics evidence collected from the scene would soon be analyzed. Striations on the bullets recovered from the victim's body would be compared to the rifling characteristics of known firearms. The shell casings would be entered into NIBIN, National Integrated Ballistic Information Network, to see if the gun had been used in previous crimes. This scientific back end of the investigation was just spinning up, turning the chaos of the street into data points that could be presented in court. But in the immediate aftermath, as the police lights faded and the darkness reclaimed South 17th Street, the focus was on the human cost. A 2-3-year-old man was dead. His future had been canceled in a burst of gunfire. The motive was irrelevant to the finality of the outcome. Whether born of a petty dispute, a territory struggle, or a personal vendetta, the result was the same: a body in the morgue and a killer in the wind. The hunt for Jyheir Mosley-Williams and Benny Chisholm had begun. The car that had facilitated the murder was now a marked vessel, hunted by every patrol officer with a radio. The unity between the driver and the shooter, forged in the adrenaline of the kill, was still intact in these early hours. They were accomplices, bound by the blood they had spilled. They likely believed they had gotten away with it, that the darkness and speed had masked their identities. They could not know that the very casings they left behind, the digital trails of their movement, and the eventual fracturing of their loyalty would lead them to a courtroom years later. For now, the crime was complete. The gun had been fired. The life had been taken. The silence that followed on South 17th Street was heavy with the weight of what had just occurred. A senseless, brutal execution that left a hole in the fabric of the city, a void that no amount of justice could ever truly fill. The story of the investigation was just starting, but the story of the murder of Jacoby Strain Hankerson had reached its tragic, violent conclusion on the cold pavement of a Harrisburg street. For nearly 48 hours, the city of Harrisburg held its breath, the silence of the streets masking the frantic, high-stakes operation unfolding within the bureaus of law enforcement. The shooting on South 17th Street had been brazen, a violent disruption of the early spring evening that left Jacoby Strain Hankerson dead and a community on edge. While Jyheir Mosley-Williams and Benny Chisholm had vanished into the urban labyrinth, believing the darkness had swallowed their tracks, the machinery of justice had already begun to turn with grinding, inevitable precision. The initial chaos of the crime scene, with its flashing lights and yellow tape, soon gave way to the cold, methodical work of the manhunt. Detectives from the Harrisburg Police Bureau, working in tandem with county resources, began the tedious process of reconstructing the timeline. The physical evidence collected from the asphalt, the spent shell casings that littered the ground like brass confetti, offered the first tangible link to the weapon used, but it was the digital footprint and surveillance grid that would ultimately close the net. In modern homicide investigations, the street is rarely as empty as it seems. Cameras mounted on businesses, private residences, and traffic intersections act as silent witnesses, unblinking and objective. Investigators scoured hours of footage, looking for the vehicle that matched the description given by shell-shocked witnesses. They needed to trace the path of the car that had slowed, fired, and fled. The breakthrough came through the identification of the vehicle. Once the make and model were isolated, the license plate became a beacon. The car was not a phantom, it was a registered machine, tethered to names and addresses. As investigators pulled the threads, the names Benny Chisholm and Jyheir Mosley-Williams surfaced, moving from the periphery of the investigation to the center of the target board. The realization that the shooter and the driver were likely still in the area, potentially armed and undoubtedly dangerous, escalated the response. This was no longer just a homicide investigation. It was an active fugitive hunt. The United States Marshals Service Fugitive Task Force was engaged, bringing federal resources and tactical expertise to the pursuit. These teams specialize in the darkest aspect of police work, locating violent offenders who do not wish to be found. By tracking the movements of the suspects and their known associates, intelligence narrowed the search radius. The fugitives were not running for the border. They were ground-bound, hiding in plain sight within the familiar geography of the city. Electronic surveillance and old-fashioned stakeouts converged on a specific residence. The location was flagged, and the operational planning began. In situations involving murder suspects, the element of surprise is the most valuable weapon law enforcement possesses. A daylight knock on the door is rarely an option. Instead, the strategy shifted to a tactical containment, a method designed to overwhelm the occupants with presence and force before they could formulate a violent reaction. The operation launched in the gray hours of the morning, a time chosen to catch the targets at their lowest level of alertness. Tactical teams, clad in heavy body armor and carrying ballistic shields, moved silently into position. The perimeter was established first. Officers fanned out to cover every exit point, ensuring the back alleys and side yards were sealed. The house was effectively cut off from the rest of the world. The silence of the neighborhood was about to be shattered not by gunfire, but by the authoritative boom of law enforcement commands. At the front of the residence, the stack of officers prepared for the breach. The tension in these moments is palpable, a thick, suffocating pressure, where split-second decisions determine life or death. The command was given. "Police, search warrant, open the door." The shout echoed off the neighboring brick row homes, a sudden jarring intrusion into the morning calm. There was no immediate answer. The occupants inside, jolted from sleep or vigil, were now faced with the reality that their time had run out. Inside the residence, the reaction was panic. The sudden presence of the task force triggered the instinct to flee. Movement was detected inside. Officers on the perimeter kept their eyes trained on the windows, the most likely avenues of escape or attack. It is common in these raids for suspects to attempt to discard weapons or contraband, or to make a desperate jump for freedom. The radio channels crackled with updates. Movement on the second floor, side window. The house, which moments ago had seemed dormant, was now alive with frantic energy. The windows became the focal point of the standoff. Blinds shifted, shadows moved behind the glass. The tactical team held their ground, weapons trained on the openings. They warned the occupants to show their hands, to step away from the ledge. The psychological pressure of a surrounded building is immense. The knowledge that every exit is blocked, every angle covered, forces a decision. For the suspects, the choice was between surrender and a suicidal confrontation. The barricade was psychological as much as physical. Doors were locked, furniture likely shifted, but the true barrier was the refusal to accept the end of the run. Negotiators and tactical commanders continued to hail the house, their voices amplified, demanding the occupants' exit with their hands raised. The warnings were clear. The house was surrounded, and entry was imminent. The delay tactics employed by those inside ignoring commands, moving between rooms, refusing to open the door, only served to heighten the alert level of the officers outside. They knew that a delay often meant the suspects were arming themselves or destroying evidence. The risk factor climbed with every passing second of non-compliance. Finally, the physical breach began. The door was forced, the sound of the ram hitting the frame signaling the end of the negotiation phase. Teams flooded into the entryway, their movements choreographed and efficient. Clear left, clear right. The shouts were sharp and disciplined. Room by room, the house was secured. The air was heavy with the dust of the breach and the intensity of the search. The officers moved toward the source of the movement they had observed from the street. Upstairs, the net closed completely. Jyheir Mosley-Williams and Benny Chisholm were located. The defiance that had fueled the shooting and the subsequent flight evaporated in the face of overwhelming tactical superiority. There was nowhere left to run. The windows they had peered out of were covered by rifles from the street. The stairs they had retreated up were swarmed by officers. The physical arrest is often a chaotic blur of shouting and restraint, a stark contrast to the quiet malice of the crime itself. Hands were seized, pulled behind backs, and secured in steel cuffs. The distinct, ratcheting sound of the handcuffs clicking shut marked the official conclusion of the manhunt. Mosley-Williams, the young man who had pulled the trigger on South 17th Street, was now in custody. The bravado of the drive-by, the power of holding the weapon, was stripped away, leaving him just another suspect in the grip of the state. He was patted down, searched for weapons, and led out of the residence. The transition from predator to prisoner was immediate. The walk from the front door to the waiting transport vehicle is a perp walk of sorts, a public unveiling of the accused. Neighbors, drawn by the commotion, peered from behind curtains and porches. witnessing the removal of the threat from their midst. The scene inside the house was frozen for processing. Detectives moved in to replace the tactical teams. They searched for the gun, for the clothing worn during the shooting, for any physical link to the murder of Jacoby Strain Hankerson. The barricades, whether furniture piled against a door or simply the locked mindset of the fugitives, had failed. The windows, once portals for potential escape, had become frames for their capture. The investigation shifted gears instantly from pursuit to prosecution. Chisholm and Mosley-Williams were separated, a standard procedure to prevent them from coordinating their stories. The unity of the car ride, where driver and shooter acted as one, was severed. They were placed in separate vehicles, transported to the booking center to be processed. The adrenaline of the arrest began to fade, replaced by the grim reality of interrogation rooms and holding cells. For Mosley-Williams, the gravity of the situation was absolute. He was 18 years old, facing charges that could and eventually would consume the prime decades of his life. The arrest did not bring immediate answers, however. It brought denials. It brought the sullen silence of those who believe they can still outmaneuver the system. But the detectives had what they needed: the bodies in the chairs. The process of dismantling their defenses would take time, relying on the friction between the two accomplices to generate the truth. The manhunt had been a sprint. The legal battle would be a marathon. As the police vehicles pulled away, the neighborhood on South 17th Street remained scarred by the violence of the previous days, but the immediate danger had been excised. The yellow tape came down, but the memory of the shooting remained. The capture of Mosley-Williams was a tactical success, a demonstration of the reach of the law. Yet for the family of Jacoby Strain Hankerson, the arrest was only the first step on a long, painful road through the criminal justice system. The man who had taken their son was behind bars, but the heartache was far from over. The wheels of the court began to turn, setting the stage for the years of legal wrangling, the plea deals, and the final shocking display of disrespect in a courtroom that lay 4 years in the future. For now, the hunt was over. The shooter was caught. The city exhaled, if only for a moment. For the family of Jacoby Strain Hankerson, the initial relief of an arrest quickly dissolved into the agonizing uncertainty of the judicial process. The transition from the chaotic crime scene on South 17th Street to the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridors of the Dauphin County Courthouse introduced a new set of adversaries: silence, procedure, and the fragile nature of witness testimony. While the police had done their job in locating the suspects, the prosecution, led by Chief Deputy District Attorney Stephen Zawiski, faced the arduous task of converting forensic leads and circumstantial evidence into a conviction that would stick. The cornerstone of the Commonwealth's case rested not just on ballistics or video surveillance, but on the cooperation of the man behind the wheel of the vehicle from which the fatal shots were fired: Benny Chisholm. In the immediate wake of the 16th of March 2022 shooting, the dynamic between the two suspects, Jyheir Mosley-Williams and Benny Chisholm, defined the trajectory of the legal proceedings. Mosley-Williams, 18 years old at the time of the murder, was identified as the passenger, the individual who had physically wielded the weapon and fired the rounds that killed the 23-year-old victim. Chisholm, the driver, occupied a precarious legal position. Under Pennsylvania law, his role as the driver in a drive-by shooting exposed him to severe criminal liability, potentially equal to that of the shooter under theories of accomplice liability or conspiracy. However, the prosecution recognized a strategic necessity. To secure a first-degree murder conviction against the shooter, to prove the specific intent to kill, they needed the driver to break the code of the street and testify against his passenger. The early stages of the legal battle were marked by a frustration common in gang-related or retaliatory homicides: the refusal to cooperate. Chisholm initially adhered to a strict policy of silence. Without his testimony placing the gun in Mosley-Williams' hand and detailing the moments leading up to the trigger pull, the state's case faced significant evidentiary hurdles. Surveillance footage could place the car at the scene, and ballistics could match the bullet to a gun, but proving beyond a reasonable doubt which occupant fired the weapon remained a challenge defense attorneys were eager to exploit. The defense for Mosley-Williams prepared to argue that the physical evidence was circumstantial, creating a fog of doubt regarding the identity of the shooter. This stalemate came to a head during the preliminary hearing phase, a critical juncture where the prosecution must present a prima facie case to move the matter to trial. With Chisholm refusing to testify, the Commonwealth found its hands tied. The evidence, while pointing toward guilt, lacked the direct narrative link required to sustain the most serious charges in a court of law at that specific moment. In a move that devastated the Strain-Hankerson family and shocked observers, the charges against Mosley-Williams were withdrawn. It was a tactical retreat by the district attorney's office, not a concession of innocence. In the American legal system, withdrawing charges at the preliminary stage does not invoke double jeopardy. It allows the state to regroup, gather more evidence, and refile once the case is stronger. However, to the public and the grieving family, it appeared as a momentary failure of justice. The suspect was technically no longer facing the murder charge, a terrifying reality for a community still reeling from the violence. The period following the dismissal was characterized by intense behind-the-scenes maneuvering. Chief Deputy D.A. Zawiski and his team focused their pressure on Chisholm. The reality of Chisholm's own situation began to set in. He was not merely a witness, he was a co-defendant facing the prospect of decades in prison for his role in the homicide. The prosecution leveraged this reality, presenting a stark dichotomy: maintain silence and face the full weight of a murder conspiracy charge, or cooperate, testify truthfully against the shooter, and receive consideration for that cooperation. It is a grim calculus, a prisoner's dilemma played out with real lives. Slowly, the wall of silence began to crack. The loyalty between the driver and the passenger eroded under the pressure of self-preservation. Chisholm eventually agreed to testify. His account provided the missing pieces of the puzzle. He detailed the events of the 16th of March 2022, describing the drive down South 17th Street. He identified Mosley-Williams as the shooter, confirming that the shots were fired from the passenger side of the vehicle. This testimony transformed the case from a circumstantial collection of facts into a direct narrative of intent and action. With Chisholm now locked in as a witness for the Commonwealth, the prosecution moved swiftly to refile the charges against Mosley-Williams. The case was resurrected, stronger and more formidable than before. The brief window of legal limbo closed, and Mosley-Williams was once again squarely facing the consequences of the murder. As the case moved toward a potential trial in the Court of Common Pleas, the defense team for Mosley-Williams had to reassess their position. The reintroduction of the charges, bolstered by the driver's testimony, eliminated the ambiguity they had hoped to leverage. A jury trial carried the risk of a first-degree murder conviction, which in Pennsylvania carries a mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. The testimony of an accomplice is always subject to cross-examination and scrutiny regarding their plea deal, but when corroborated by video and physical evidence, it becomes a lethal weapon for the prosecution. The defense recognized that the narrative of a wrong place, wrong time, or a case of mistaken identity was no longer tenable against the direct accusation of the co-conspirator. Negotiations for a plea agreement intensified as the trial date approached. The prosecution, while confident in the strengthened case, also had to weigh the certainty of a conviction against the variables of a jury trial and the emotional toll on the Strain-Hankerson family. Trials force families to relive the trauma in high definition, viewing autopsy photos and hearing the clinical details of their loved one's death. A plea agreement offers finality. It guarantees a conviction and a sentence, removing the possibility of an acquittal or a mistrial. The charge on the table became third-degree murder. Unlike first-degree murder, which requires a specific intent to kill, or second-degree murder, which involves a killing during the commission of a felony, third-degree murder in Pennsylvania covers all other kinds of murder, generally involving malice. It acknowledged the extreme recklessness and malign intent of firing a gun from a moving vehicle into a public street, resulting in death, without necessarily proving the premeditated specific intent to execute Jacoby Strain-Hankerson specifically, or simply serving as a pragmatic compromise to ensure a lengthy incarceration. In February 2026, nearly 4 years after the shooting, the legal marathon reached its conclusion. Jyheir Mosley-Williams appeared before Judge Edward Marsico to enter his plea. The courtroom atmosphere was heavy with the accumulated grief of the years that had passed. The defendant stood to answer the judge's colloquy, admitting his guilt to the charge of third-degree murder. By entering this plea, he waived his right to a trial, his right to confront witnesses, including Benny Chisholm, and his right to appeal the facts of the case. He accepted the narrative that he was the one who pulled the trigger. The negotiated sentence was significant: 18 to 40 years in a state correctional institution. This structure meant Mosley-Williams would serve a minimum of 18 years before becoming eligible for parole, with the potential to remain incarcerated for up to 4 decades. For a young man who was 18 at the time of the crime, this sentence encompassed the entirety of his young adulthood and well into his middle age. It was a severe punishment, reflecting the senseless nature of the violence that took Jacoby Strain Hankerson's life. During the plea hearing, the prosecution laid out the facts one final time for the record. They recounted the drive-by, the victim's location on South 17th Street, and the fatal injuries. They highlighted the cooperation of the co-defendant, ensuring the record reflected that the silence had been broken and the truth established. Chief Deputy D.A. Zawiski emphasized that the plea deal was a result of the overwhelming evidence gathered after the initial hurdles were cleared. The judge accepted the plea, finding it knowing, intelligent, and voluntary. The finality of the sentencing hearing was meant to be a somber moment of closure for the victim's family. The system had worked. The investigation, the initial setback, the strategic flipping of the accomplice, and the final negotiation had all led to a conviction. Jacoby Strain Hankerson's killer was going to prison. The judge prepared to formalize the sentence, offering the standard admonishments and explaining the conditions of confinement. The courtroom, divided between the grieving family of the victim and the supporters of the defendant, held its breath. However, the decorum of the court was fragile. The legal resolution, penned in documents and finalized in plea colloquies, could not dictate the emotional reality of those present. As the sentence of 18 to 40 years was handed down, the gravity of the moment was interpreted differently by the two sides of the gallery. For the victim's family, it was a measure of justice, though perhaps never enough to balance the loss of a life. For the supporters of Mosley-Williams, the number 18 represented a future date of return, a survival rather than a defeat. The tension that had simmered throughout the proceedings from the streets of Harrisburg to the preliminary hearings, and finally to this moment of judgment, was about to spill over. The legal turn had secured a conviction, but it had not resolved the underlying animosity or the lack of remorse that often accompanies such gang-related violence. As Judge Marsico concluded the sentencing, the focus shifted from the bench to the defendant's table. The script of the legal process ended there, but the human reaction was about to take an unscripted and disrespectful turn. Mosley-Williams, now a convicted murderer, prepared to leave the courtroom, but not before making a gesture that would shatter the solemnity of the proceeding and ignite a final, painful confrontation in the Hall of Justice. The deal was done, the years were assigned, but the defiance remained. As Judge Edward Marsico concluded his remarks, the weight of the sentence settled over the Dauphin County courtroom. The specific terms were pronounced with the dry finality of the law: 18 to 40 years in a state correctional institution. This range was the result of the negotiated plea to third-degree murder, a legal resolution that acknowledged the intentional malice of the act while avoiding the uncertainties of a trial where witness cooperation had been a fragile variable. The 18-year minimum meant that Jyheir Mosley-Williams, having entered the system as a teenager, would not see a parole hearing until he was well into his 30s. The 40-year maximum ensured that the state retained control over his liberty potentially until he was nearly 60 years old. For the family of Jacoby Strain Hankerson, the sentence was a judicial acknowledgement of their loss, a guarantee that the person who pulled the trigger on South 17th Street would be removed from society for decades. However, the solemnity demanded by such a proceeding, where a young life had been extinguished and another forfeited to prison, was shattered in the seconds following the pronouncement. As the court deputies prepared to remand Mosley-Williams into custody, the defendant turned his attention away from the bench and away from the grieving family of the man he killed. He looked toward the gallery section occupied by his associates and friends. In a deliberate motion, Mosley-Williams raised his hands and formed a heart symbol. It was a gesture that, in other contexts, might suggest affection or contrition, but here, in the cold light of a murder sentencing, it functioned as a signal of defiance and gang solidarity. It was a communication that bypassed the gravity of the court to reassure his supporters that his spirit remained unbroken, that he was accepting his incarceration not as a penance, but as a rite of passage. He offered no words of apology to the Strain-Hankerson family, nor did he display the visible weight of guilt that the court expects during the allocation phase. His focus was entirely on his own circle. The reaction from the gallery was instantaneous and volatile. The group supporting Mosley-Williams did not bow their heads or weep for the long separation ahead. Instead, they erupted in what could only be described as a celebration. The courtroom, typically a sanctuary of enforced silence and rigid decorum, was filled with the sounds of cheering and vocal validation for the killer. Several individuals in the group pulled out their smartphones, violating the strict prohibition against recording devices in the courtroom. They began filming the defendant and themselves, capturing the moment for social media consumption, turning a murder sentencing into a spectacle of performative loyalty. This outburst was not merely a breach of protocol, it was a direct assault on the dignity of the victim's family. Sitting just feet away, the relatives of Jacoby Strain-Hankerson were forced to witness the glorification of the man who had murdered their son and brother. The cheering from the defense side acted as a fresh wound, a signal that the violence on the street had not ended with the verdict, but had simply moved indoors. The supporters behaved as if the 18 to 40-year sentence was a victory lap, seemingly oblivious or indifferent to the reality that a 23-year-old man was dead and never coming home. The presiding authority, Judge Marsico, reacted swiftly to the disintegration of order within his courtroom. A veteran of the bench, Marsico had presided over countless sentencings, yet the brazen nature of this display drew a sharp and immediate rebuke. He admonished the group, his voice cutting through the noise. He ordered the cessation of the recording and the restoration of order, signaling to the sheriff's deputies to assert control over the gallery. The judge's admonishment was not just about the rules of the court, it was a condemnation of the behavior that stripped the proceedings of their necessary gravity. He made it clear that the courtroom was a place of judgment, not a stage for gang validation. The chaos required the physical intervention of courtroom security. Deputies moved to separate the factions and silence the outburst, ensuring that the celebratory atmosphere was extinguished. The juxtaposition was stark. The somber, tearful grief of the victim's family clashed violently with the raucous, almost festive defiance of the defendant's supporters. The behavior suggested a complete disconnect from the tragedy of the crime, treating the homicide as a score in a game rather than a catastrophic loss of human life. Chief Deputy District Attorney Stephen Zawiski watched the scene unfold with palpable disgust. As the prosecutor who had navigated the complex legal hurdles to secure the conviction, including the arduous process of flipping the driver, Benny Chisholm Zawiski viewed the display as an affirmation of the defendant's dangerous character. He did not mince words when addressing the court and the record regarding the spectacle. He labeled the behavior of Mosley-Williams and his supporters as pathetic. This descriptor was not chosen lightly. It reflected the prosecution's view that the defendant and his circle lacked the emotional maturity or moral compass to comprehend the devastation they had caused. Zawiski's condemnation went beyond verbal disapproval. He recognized that the heart gesture and the subsequent celebration were indicators of a lack of rehabilitation. The system operates on the hope that a sentence will induce reflection and change, but Mosley-Williams' final act in the courtroom demonstrated the opposite. The prosecutor announced his intention to ensure that this moment would follow the defendant for the entirety of his incarceration. Zawiski vowed to write a letter to the Pennsylvania Board of Probation and Parole, detailing the events that transpired immediately after sentencing. This administrative threat carried significant long-term implications. When Mosley-Williams eventually becomes eligible for parole after serving his minimum 18 years, the parole board will review his file to determine if he is fit for release. A letter from the prosecuting attorney describing a lack of remorse, disrespect for the court, and celebration of the crime serves as a powerful argument against release. The heart gesture, intended as a fleeting signal to his friends, was effectively converted by the prosecutor into evidence of future risk. The moment of defiance bought Mosley-Williams status in the eyes of his supporters, but it likely purchased him additional years, if not decades, behind bars. The judge ordered the removal of the disruptors, clearing the toxicity from the room so that the final administrative tasks could be completed. The Strain-Hankerson family was left to process the trauma of the hearing. They had come seeking closure and justice, and while the law had provided a sentence, the courtroom dynamic had denied them peace. The visual of the killer throwing up a heart sign while his friends cheered was a final insult, a reminder that while the legal case was closed, the cultural cycle of violence and disrespect that fueled the murder persisted. As the deputies handcuffed Mosley-Williams to transport him to the holding cells, the reality of the 40-year tale began to take hold. The supporters who had cheered would leave the courthouse and return to their lives, their phones full of video clips. Mosley-Williams, however, was heading to a state correctional institution where the celebration would cease. The bravado displayed for the gallery would offer no protection against the regimented, grinding reality of a long-term prison sentence. The pathetic display, as Zawiski termed it, had stripped away any facade of martyrdom and revealed the immaturity at the core of the violence. The legal conclusion of the case against Jyheir Mosley-Williams was marked not by a somber acceptance of guilt, but by a collision of two worlds, the rule of law and the code of the street. The sentence of 18 to 40 years stood as the state's answer to the shooting of Jacoby Strain-Hankerson. The heart gesture stood as the defendant's answer to the state. In the end, the judge and the prosecutor ensured that the record reflected the truth of that afternoon, that justice was served, but remorse was entirely absent. The doors of the courtroom swung shut, leaving the victim's family to carry the memory of their loved one, while the system swallowed the young man who had taken him away, now burdened with the consequences of his final defiant act. To the senseless loss of Jacoby Strain-Hankerson. The plea agreement, finalized in February 2026, had been a calculated decision by the prosecution. With the reliability of Benny Chisholm, the driver-turned-cooperating witness, always a variable in a potential jury trial, the Commonwealth accepted a guilty plea to third-degree murder. This ensured a conviction and removed the gamble of an acquittal, but it also capped the maximum penalty Mosley-Williams would face. The courtroom in Dauphin County was packed, divided strictly down the center by the invisible but impenetrable wall of grief and allegiance. On one side sat the family of Jacoby Strain-Hankerson, bracing themselves for the finality of the proceedings. On the other gathered the supporters of Jyheir Mosley-Williams, a contingent that would soon turn the solemnity of the sentencing hearing into a spectacle of misplaced loyalty. Judge Edward Marsico, presiding over the tense assembly, reviewed the terms of the agreement. The negotiated sentence was significant: 18 to 40 years in a state correctional institution. For a young man who had committed the crime at 18, this meant his entire 20s, 30s, and nearly half of his 40s would be consumed by the Department of Corrections. It was a punishment designed to incapacitate, a decades-long timeout from society mandated by the violent finality of the drive-by shooting on South 17th Street. As Judge Marsico formally pronounced the sentence, the gravity of the moment should have suffocated the room. The slamming of the metaphorical gavel usually signals a time for quiet reflection or suppressed weeping. Instead, the air in the Harrisburg courtroom shattered. As the sentence was read, finalizing his transition from defendant to convicted murderer, Mosley-Williams did not bow his head or look to the victim's family. He turned his back on the bench and faced the gallery where his associates sat. In a fluid, practiced motion, he raised his hands and formed a heart symbol with his fingers, flashing the gesture to his friends. It was a signal that instantly dissolved the decorum of the Court of Common Pleas. The reaction from his supporters was immediate and explosive. They did not recoil at the length of the prison term or the reality that their friend was being taken away for nearly 2 decades. Instead, they erupted in celebration. Shouts of support and declarations of love filled the room. drowning out the residual echoes of the judge's voice. Several individuals in the group pulled out smartphones, holding them high to record the convict's departure, capturing the heart sign for social media distribution. They treated the sentencing not as a condemnation of murder, but as a graduation ceremony or a farewell party. The flash of screens and the raucous vocalizations signaled a complete rejection of the court's authority and a total disregard for the Strain-Hankerson family, who were forced to witness the killer of their loved one being celebrated merely feet away from where they sat in mourning. Judge Marsico, a veteran jurist known for maintaining strict control over his courtroom, reacted swiftly to the disruption. The display was a flagrant contempt of the judicial process. He admonished the group, his voice cutting through the noise, ordering an immediate cessation of the recording and the celebrating. The judge's reprimand was sharp, highlighting the absolute inappropriateness of cheering for a man who had just admitted to taking a human life. The supporters were silenced by the threat of ejection and legal repercussions, but the damage to the dignity of the proceeding had already been done. The atmosphere had shifted from one of justice served to one of toxic defiance. Chief Deputy District Attorney Stephen Zawiski watched the scene with visible disdain. For a prosecutor who had navigated the complexities of the case, including the initial withdrawal of charges and the arduous process of securing Chisholm's testimony, the display was infuriating. Zawiski took the floor to address the behavior directly, refusing to let the moment pass as mere youthful indiscretion. He characterized the heart sign and the subsequent celebration as pathetic. In his assessment, the actions of Mosley-Williams and his entourage demonstrated a profound lack of remorse and a disturbing disconnect from the reality of the crime. Zawiski's condemnation went beyond verbal scolding. He recognized that the display was not just a fleeting moment of disrespect, but a piece of evidence regarding the convict's character. The prosecutor announced his intention to ensure that this specific moment followed Mosley-Williams for the duration of his incarceration. Zawiski vowed to formally report the courtroom conduct to the Pennsylvania Board of Probation and Parole. The logic was punitive and pragmatic. When Mosley-Williams eventually becomes eligible for parole after serving his minimum sentence of 18 years, the board would not be looking at a blank file. They would be presented with the record of his behavior at sentencing, a record showing that when faced with the consequences of murder, his priority was to posture for his friends rather than show contrition for his victim. The implications of Zawiski's promise were severe. In the Pennsylvania state system, parole is a privilege, not a right. A candidate must demonstrate maturity, rehabilitation, and an acceptance of responsibility. By capturing the pathetic display in the official record, the prosecution ensured that the heart sign made in 2026 would cast a shadow all the way to 2044. The celebration that lasted seconds in the courtroom could potentially cost Mosley-Williams additional years of freedom, as future parole evaluators would view the footage or read the transcripts and see a prisoner who mocked the gravity of his own sentencing. For the family of Jacoby Strain-Hankerson, the spectacle was a final bitter insult. They had endured the agonizing wait for justice, the uncertainty of the legal proceedings, and the re-traumatization of the hearing, only to see the perpetrator's circle treating the outcome as a triumph of reputation. The disconnect was jarring. While one family prepared to leave the courthouse with nothing but memories of a murdered son, the other side seemed energized by the street credibility the conviction apparently conferred. The victim's family maintained their composure, standing as the quiet counterweight to the noise, their dignity intact despite the chaos erupting on the other side of the aisle. As sheriff's deputies moved to secure Mosley-Williams and escort him from the courtroom, the celebration was cut short by the physical reality of custody. The handcuffs, the shackles, and the uniformed officers were the tangible end to the performance. The supporters were ushered out, their phones lowered, leaving the silence to finally return to the chamber. The heart gesture, intended as a sign of solidarity and defiance, had instead sealed the narrative of the day. It stripped away any potential sympathy for the young defendant's long sentence and replaced it with a consensus of disgust among the court officers. The doors to the holding cell closed behind Jyheir Mosley-Williams, separating him from the audience he had performed for. The cheers of his friends would not follow him into the transport van, nor would they be heard inside the walls of the state correctional institution where he would spend the next phase of his life. The bravado displayed in the courtroom offered no immunity against the regimented, grinding reality of a long-term prison sentence. The pathetic display, as Zawiski termed it, had stripped away any facade of martyrdom and revealed the immaturity at the core of the violence. Ultimately, the sentencing of Jyheir Mosley-Williams served as a stark illustration of the divergent realities occupying the same city. In one reality, the legal system operated on facts, consequences, and the sanctity of life. In the other, represented by the flashing heart sign and the cheering gallery, incarceration was normalized, and violent reputation was currency. The clash of these worlds in Judge Marsico's courtroom resulted in a sentence that satisfied the statute but highlighted the deep cultural fissures that fuel such tragedies. The case was legally closed, the paperwork filed, and the years tallied, but the image of a killer signaling love to a cheering crowd over the body of a legal judgment remained the haunting epitaph of the proceedings.